which my pregnant wife started bringing her dead husband back into our marriage. I didn't understand why until it was almost too late. Throwaway account? This is long and I've tried writing it shorter 3 separate times and given up each time because the short version makes it sound like a ghost story and it isn't one. It's a story about grief and about how long it took me to understand that the thing I was jealous of wasn't actually a dead man at all. I found my 7 months pregnant wife sitting on the floor of the nursery at 11 at night, lights off except for the small lamp shaped like a crescent moon we'd bought for the corner of the room, holding a photograph I'd never seen before of a man I recognized immediately even though we'd never met. Adrian. Her first husband, 6 years dead by then, and there she was, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, the other holding his photograph like it was something fragile enough to break if she gripped it too hard. She wasn't crying. That's the part that unsettled me more than anything else about the scene. She looked calm, almost peaceful, in a way that felt entirely disconnected from what I understood grief to look like after 8 years of marriage. When she noticed me in the doorway, she didn't flinch or try to hide the photograph. She just looked up and said quietly, "He would have been a good father." I didn't know, standing there, that a plain brown package with no return address had arrived at our house exactly 6 days earlier, or that it would be the first of several, each one bringing some fragment of a dead man's life back into ours, each one making my wife more distant and more frightened at the same time, in a way I wouldn't fully understand for months. I also didn't know, standing in that doorway, that Elise already suspected something about Adrian's death that she'd never told a single living person, including me. I'm Caleb Mercer, 35, a civil engineer, the kind of steady, methodical profession that suits someone who genuinely believes, or believed, at least before all of this, that most problems can be solved if you're patient enough and organized enough about identifying their actual cause. My wife Elise is 33, an archivist at a regional history museum, meticulous and quietly passionate about her work in a way I always found deeply attractive. The kind of person who could tell you, unprompted, the entire provenance of some obscure 19th century object most visitors walk straight past without a second glance. We met almost 5 years ago, 3 years after Adrian's death, at a fundraiser for the museum that a mutual friend had dragged me to. She told me about Adrian on our second date, plainly, without drama, the way you'd mention any significant fact about your own history to someone you were hoping might eventually matter. I appreciated that honesty immediately. I never asked her to pretend Adrian hadn't existed, and she never asked me to either. And for most of the 5 years that followed, that arrangement worked exactly the way it was supposed to. I want to be clear, before I go any further, that this isn't a story about a neglectful husband who drove his wife back into the arms of a memory because he wasn't paying enough attention. I think about our early years together more than almost anything else from this whole ordeal, because I need to hold on to the fact that what we had was real before I try to explain how strange it eventually became. I remember the night I proposed, on the back porch of a rental cabin we'd driven 4 hours to reach. Nothing elaborate, just the two of us in a ring I'd been carrying around nervously for 3 weeks trying to find the right moment. I remember how hard she laughed, genuinely laughed, when I fumbled the whole speech I'd rehearsed and ended up just blurting out the question in the middle of a sentence about the weather. I remember the year her mother was sick, and how I rearranged 3 separate work projects to be there for every hospital visit, not because I was performing devotion for anyone watching, but because it never once occurred to me not to be there. When she got pregnant, a little over a year ago now, the joy between us felt uncomplicated in a way I don't think either of us had fully expected, given everything else sitting in both our histories. We spent the first few months picking out names, painting the nursery a soft, undecided green neither of us could commit to calling blue or gray, staying up late some nights just talking about who this person was going to turn out to be. The shift started, as far as I can trace it back now, somewhere around the 5th month, subtle enough at first that I genuinely didn't register it as a pattern until it had already been building for weeks. I came home one evening to find her listening to an album I didn't recognize, something moody and stripped down that didn't match her usual taste at all. And when I asked about it, she told me almost offhandedly that it had been one of Adrian's favorites, that she'd found herself thinking about it out of nowhere that afternoon and decided to look it up. I told myself that was normal enough. Pregnancy making people sentimental, memory working in strange associative ways when your body is doing something as enormous as growing another person. A week or 2 later, I noticed she'd been searching through old photo albums, ones from her first marriage that had mostly stayed packed away in a closet since before we'd even met. And when I asked what had prompted it, she said she wasn't entirely sure, just a pull she'd been feeling that she couldn't fully explain. She started asking me questions about Adrian she hadn't asked in years, not accusatory or strange on their own, just oddly specific. What I thought he might have looked like as an older man, whether I thought he would have been a hands-on father or a more distant one, questions that assumed a level of familiarity with a stranger I'd never actually met. She started visiting the cemetery more often too, which on its own wouldn't have troubled me at all. She'd always gone occasionally on his birthday, on the anniversary of his death, ordinary, expected grief maintenance that I'd never once resented. But the visits became more frequent, weekly and then, for a stretch, closer to twice a week, and she began wearing a necklace I recognized from old photographs, a simple silver pendant Adrian had apparently given her early in their relationship, something she hadn't worn once in the 5 years I'd known her. I noticed too that she'd started referring to him differently in conversation, less like a settled memory and more like an active presence in the room. One evening, rubbing her stomach the way she often did by that point in the pregnancy, she said quietly, almost to herself, "I wonder what he would have thought about the baby." I noticed with a small cold jolt I couldn't entirely explain to myself that she'd said he instead of you, as though the more natural version of that sentence, the one about the actual father of the child she was carrying, hadn't even occurred to her to say first. I mentioned all of it to my closest friend Jonah Reed over drinks one night, mostly venting in the low grade, half-ashamed way you vent about something you're not sure you're even allowed to be upset about. "She's grieving," Jonah told me without much hesitation, the way a person tells you something they genuinely believe rather than something they're just saying to end the conversation. "Pregnancy does strange things to people's heads, Caleb. Hormones, mortality, all of it stirred up at once. Let her grieve. It doesn't mean anything about you." I wanted badly to believe that, and for a while I mostly did. I told myself repeatedly that a good husband doesn't get threatened by his wife's grief for a man who died years before they ever met, that jealousy of a dead person was about the pettiest, most small-minded thing a person could feel, and that feeling it at all reflected worse on me than it did on anything Elise was actually doing. The packages started a few weeks after that conversation with Jonah, and they're the reason I eventually stopped being able to explain all of this away as ordinary grief. The first one arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday, a plain brown package with no return address, addressed to Elise in handwriting neither of us recognized. Inside was a single photograph of Adrian, taken, as far as I could tell, sometime in his late 20s, standing on some kind of overlook with mountains behind him. A photograph Elise told me once she'd recovered enough to speak she had never seen before in her life and had no idea existed. She became genuinely frightened looking at it, more frightened than the object itself seemed to warrant on its own, and when I asked her who might have sent it, she said honestly that she didn't know, that as far as she was aware, nobody outside their immediate circle back then would have had access to a photograph like that. I assumed at the time it was some strange, misguided gesture from an old friend of Adrian's, something well-intentioned even if deeply tone-deaf given how far along Elise was in an entirely different marriage. A week later, a second package arrived. This one contained a camera, an old, slightly battered one that Elise identified immediately, her hands trembling as she turned it over. Adrian's camera, the one he'd used for most of his professional work, the one Elise had always believed was lost, along with most of his other equipment, sometime in the chaotic weeks after his death. I remember asking her, as gently as I could manage while my own unease climbed steadily higher, whether she had any theory at all about who might have access to belongings that specific, that personal, 6 years after his death. She didn't, or if she did, she wasn't telling me yet. I want to be honest about the shape my own jealousy took during this period because I think it's an important, uncomfortable part of the story, not something I can simply skip past to get to the mystery. I hated feeling it. I remember lying awake more than one night turning over some version of the thought, how exactly am I supposed to compete with someone who can never disappoint her again, never leave dishes in the sink, never say the wrong thing during an argument, never age or change or become anything less than whatever idealized version 6 years of grief had sanded him down into. I noticed once I started paying attention, small comparisons creeping into ordinary conversations that I don't think Elise was even fully aware she was making. We'd be driving somewhere during a thunderstorm and she'd mention, almost automatically, that Adrian used to love photographing storms, chasing them for hours with an intensity she'd once found thrilling and occasionally exhausting. We'd visit some overlook on a weekend trip, and she'd say quietly that Adrian had loved a place just like this one. Small sentences, each one innocent enough on its own, accumulating into something that made me feel increasingly like I was living inside a house with 2 marriages instead of one. I finally asked her directly one night after another one of those small, offhand comparisons, "Do you miss him?" She didn't hesitate before answering, and something in the honesty of that non-hesitation hurt more than any evasive answer could have. "Every day," she said. Then seeing my face she added quickly, "That doesn't mean I don't love you, Caleb. Both things are true at the same time. I don't know how to make that make sense to you except to just keep saying it." It was around this same period that I discovered, entirely by accident, that Elise had been visiting a storage unit across town that she'd never once mentioned to me in 5 years together. I found the receipt tucked into an old coat pocket while doing laundry, a monthly charge going back further than I could easily account for. And when I asked her about it, she went quiet in a way that told me before she said a single word that this wasn't something she'd simply forgotten to mention. She admitted eventually that the unit held most of what remained of Adrian's belongings, things she'd never fully been able to part with after his death but hadn't wanted sitting in our own house either, a compromise she'd apparently been managing privately for years without ever bringing me into it. I asked to see it. She hesitated for a long moment before agreeing, and I understood, watching her hesitate, that agreeing cost her something significant. The unit itself was smaller than I expected, a modest collection of boxes and a few larger items covered in tarps, nothing dramatic on its own. But one box, tucked toward the back, contained something that shifted the entire shape of what I thought this story was about. Letters. A stack of them handwritten, dated across the final several months of Adrian's life. Letters Elise told me, her voice barely above a whisper, that she had never shown to anyone, not the police at the time, not her own family, not me. I asked why. She didn't answer right away. I started reading through them instead, and one line in particular stopped me completely, written in handwriting that grew visibly less steady toward the final pages. If anything happens to me, don't let them convince you that it was an accident. I sat with that sentence for a long time before I could make myself ask the next question. Elise, what is this? She told me finally, haltingly, that in the last few months of his life, Adrian had become convinced someone was following him, that he'd never fully explained who or why, at least not to her, and that she'd assumed at the time and for years afterward that it was simply paranoia connected to whatever project he'd been consumed by, something she'd never fully understood the details of because he'd always been guarded about his work when it was still in progress. When the official report came back describing his death as an accidental fall during a solo hike, she said she'd wanted desperately to believe it, because the alternative felt too large and too frightening to carry, especially once she understood that carrying it might mean carrying whatever danger he'd apparently believed he was in as well. I went back through the official investigation myself over the following weeks, using contacts from an old engineering colleague who did some consulting work for the county and could get me limited access to records that wouldn't normally be available to someone outside the family. What I found didn't confirm anything definitively, but it complicated the simple accident story considerably more than I expected. His camera had been found several meters from where his body was recovered, an odd distance for a straightforward fall. His phone was never located at all, despite an otherwise fairly thorough search of the immediate area. His backpack showed signs of having been moved or repositioned after the fall, according to a brief, easy-to-miss note buried in an appendix of the original report. And one photograph, apparently the final image on the camera's memory card taken the same day he died, was never included in the evidence file at all, referenced only obliquely in a line I nearly skimmed past entirely. I brought all of it to Elise, and this time she didn't deflect the way she had with the storage unit. She admitted, plainly sitting across from me at our own kitchen table, that she had in fact suspected for years that Adrian's death might not have been the accident everyone believed it was. She told me about the letter, the one that had arrived shortly before he died, warning her in vague but unmistakable terms that he believed someone was watching him, someone connected to whatever he'd been working on. She said she'd stayed silent about all of it for 6 years, because she'd been afraid, genuinely afraid, that whoever Adrian believed was following him might still be paying attention, and that speaking up, drawing any renewed attention to his death, might put her at risk in a way she'd never fully known how to explain to anyone, including herself. Then why, I asked her, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be, are you the one bringing him back into our life right now? Why now, after 6 years of staying quiet? Elise looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, something between confusion and a dawning fear that hadn't been there a moment earlier. I didn't, she said. Caleb, I didn't send any of those packages. I've been just as frightened by them as you have. I assumed, honestly, that you might have found them somehow and were testing me, and I was too scared to ask. That single exchange reframed everything. If Elise hadn't been the one bringing Adrian's belongings back into our lives, someone else had, someone with access to items that had apparently been missing for 6 years, someone who understood exactly which memories would land hardest. We started investigating together after that, an uneasy, careful partnership built on top of everything neither of us had told the other until that point. The trail eventually led to a name Elise recognized immediately from Adrian's old professional life. Vincent Hale, a colleague who had worked alongside Adrian on what turned out to be his final documentary project, something Elise had always known existed in only the vaguest terms, because Adrian had kept the details close throughout production, a habit she'd found frustrating at the time and had never fully understood the reason for. Vincent agreed to meet us reluctantly at a diner on the edge of town, visibly uncomfortable throughout most of the conversation in a way that made it hard at first to tell whether we were looking at a guilty man or simply an anxious one. He confirmed almost immediately that he had been the one sending the packages, and something in his face when he said it suggested relief more than guilt, like a confession he'd been waiting a long time for someone to finally ask him to make. "I wasn't trying to scare her," he said, glancing at Elise with an expression that looked genuinely apologetic. "I was trying to make her remember. I've been sitting on some of Adrian's things for 6 years because I didn't know what else to do with them, and every year that passed without anyone ever asking real questions about what happened to him made me more convinced nobody ever would unless something forced the memory back to the surface." I asked him what exactly he thought had happened. He was quiet for a long moment before he started carefully to explain. Adrian, it turned out, had spent the final year of his life investigating a set of illegal land deals connected to a large regional development company. Documentary work that had started as a fairly straightforward environmental piece, before evolving gradually into something considerably more dangerous once he uncovered evidence suggesting bribery and falsified permits reaching well beyond what anyone involved had expected a documentary photographer to actually find. The company, according to Vincent, had pressured Adrian to abandon the project more than once, through channels that started as polite discouragement and escalated by the final months into something closer to open intimidation. Adrian had refused to stop. The night he died, Vincent told us, Adrian had been scheduled to meet a confidential source, someone with direct knowledge of the company's dealings, at a remote trailhead not far from where his body was eventually found. He never made it to that meeting. Vincent had always suspected quietly that the two facts were connected, but with no hard proof and a police department that had closed the case quickly as an accidental fall, he'd never felt he had anything solid enough to bring forward. I asked Elise, once we were back in the car, how much of any of this she had actually known before that conversation with Vincent. She was quiet for longer than I expected before answering, and when she finally did, I understood we were about to have the hardest conversation of our entire relationship. She admitted that she had known in general terms about the documentary and its subject matter, though not the full extent of what Adrian had uncovered. She'd known, too, in the years since that there were people who might have had reason to want him silenced, a possibility she'd carried privately alone for 6 years, never telling a single person, including me, even after we married, even after I became, in every practical sense, her partner in building an entire life together. I asked her why, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "Because I was terrified," she said, "that if I ever told you any of it, you'd start investigating exactly the way you just did. You're an engineer, Caleb, you solve problems. I knew the moment I told you the truth you wouldn't be able to leave it alone, and I couldn't stand the thought of putting you in whatever danger I still half believed might still be out there, especially not with a baby coming." I told her as evenly as I could manage given how raw I felt in that moment that I understood the fear behind that choice, but that understanding it didn't make it feel any less like a betrayal. "You didn't protect me," I said. "You made the decision for me. Those aren't the same thing even if they feel the same from where you were standing." There was a doctor's appointment a few weeks into all of this, an ordinary prenatal checkup that turned into something considerably heavier once we were back in the car afterward. Elise sat with her hands folded over her stomach for a long time before she started talking, and what came out of her that afternoon was different from anything she'd told me before, something closer to an admission about her own mind than about Adrian's death specifically. She told me she'd started to realize, somewhere in the middle of the pregnancy, that some part of her had built an idealized version of Adrian in her memory over the years. A version smoothed over and softened in ways the real man, with his own real, complicated flaws, had never actually been. She reminded me gently of things she'd told me early in our relationship and that I think I'd let myself forget in the fog of everything else, that Adrian had been emotionally distant during long stretches of their marriage, consumed by his work in ways that had genuinely hurt her at the time, unreliable about small, ordinary promises in a way that had frustrated her more than once. "He wasn't a saint," she said. "I know that. I think somewhere in the last 6 years I let myself forget it, because grieving an imperfect person felt harder than grieving a perfect one, and it was easier to just quietly edit him into someone easier to miss." She told me that Adrian had always wanted children badly, in a way they'd never quite managed to align their timing around before he died, and that some part of her, watching her own body change over these past months, had become almost obsessively preoccupied with imagining what he would have been like as a father. A preoccupation she understood now had crowded out space that should have belonged to imagining me in that same role instead. It explained a great deal of her behavior over the previous months. It didn't, we both understood, explain the packages or the letters or whatever had actually happened on that trail 6 years earlier. The break in that particular thread came from an unexpected place. Going back through the box of Adrian's old belongings more carefully, I found a photograph tucked into an inner pocket of an old camera bag, one that had clearly been separated deliberately from the rest of his archive. It showed Adrian, unmistakably, sitting across a table from someone in what looked like a quiet, out-of-the-way restaurant, deep in conversation, the kind of meeting that had the careful, guarded body language of two people discussing something they didn't want overheard. I didn't recognize the other man in the photograph at first. Elise did immediately and went very pale looking at it. "That's my father," she said. I want to be honest that this discovery didn't make any sense to me at first, and it took Elise's father, a reserved, careful man named Grant Ashworth who had never fully warmed to me the way I'd hoped he eventually would, several increasingly uncomfortable conversations before he finally admitted the truth. Grant had known for years exactly what Adrian had been investigating, because Adrian had come to him directly during the final months of his life, not for permission or blessing but for help. Grant had worked decades earlier in a regional planning office and still maintained old contacts and a working understanding of exactly the kind of permitting fraud Adrian had begun uncovering. Rather than working against Adrian or remaining neutral the way Elise had always assumed, given how little her father had ever spoken about it, Grant had actually been quietly assisting him, providing context and occasionally documents that helped Adrian understand what he was looking at. "I never told Elise," Grant admitted, sitting across from us at his own kitchen table, looking older in that moment than I'd ever seen him look before, "because after he died I convinced myself that telling her would only give her something else to grieve, another version of the same loss stacked on top of the first one. I've regretted that decision more than almost anything else in my life, and I still don't know if a different choice would have actually made things easier for her." What Grant told us next reframed the mystery one final time. Adrian, in the final weeks before his death, had discovered something that had frightened him more than the development company itself. He'd become convinced that someone within his own small documentary team was leaking details of the investigation back to the company, information that would have explained how the company always seemed to know exactly how close he was getting, exactly when to escalate their pressure campaign against him. He hadn't been certain who it was. He'd suspected at various points several different people, and Grant believed, based on their final conversation together just days before Adrian died, that Adrian had finally narrowed it down to someone specific, someone he trusted enough that the betrayal, once he understood it, had shaken him considerably more than the company's threats ever had. The evidence, once we started piecing it together properly with help from Inez, no, that's not right. This was a different case entirely from anything involving journalists in other stories I've heard people compare this to since. The person who eventually helped us make sense of the documentary footage was a former colleague of Grant's, a patient, careful retired investigator named Priscilla Doyle, who agreed to look at everything we'd gathered as a favor to an old friend, pointed, at first uncomfortably, back toward Vincent himself, the very man who had spent 6 years sending Elise fragments of Adrian's life in an apparent, clumsy attempt to force the truth back to the surface. It would have made for a tidy, satisfying answer, and for about a week I genuinely believed we'd found it. Priscilla didn't. She kept coming back to inconsistencies in the timeline that didn't fit Vincent's actual movements that final week, records that placed him nowhere near the trailhead the night Adrian died, communications that, once properly dated, showed Vincent had actually spent the final months of the project trying, quietly and somewhat ineffectively, to protect Adrian rather than undermine him. The real answer, when it finally surfaced, came from a second colleague on the documentary team, a man named Desmond Farrow who had handled sound and logistics for the project and who had always existed, in Elise's memory of that period, as a minor, forgettable figure rather than anyone significant. Priscilla found records showing Desmond had been in regular, undisclosed contact with a representative of the development company throughout the final months of production, communications carefully worded enough to avoid explicit admission but damning once laid out against the full timeline. It hadn't been about money alone, though money had clearly been involved. Desmond, it turned out, had discovered, independently, evidence of an even larger cover-up connected to the same company, something involving falsified environmental assessments that reached well beyond the original land deal Adrian had been investigating, and had made the calculation, apparently, that protecting himself from that larger exposure was worth whatever it cost Adrian. The hiking trip, according to what Priscilla was eventually able to reconstruct, hadn't been a random solo outing at all. Desmond had suggested it, framed as an opportunity to get some final establishing footage for the documentary, and had been present on the trail that day, a fact conveniently omitted from every account he'd given afterward, including, apparently, to the police, who had never had any real reason at the time to question his version of events. None of what we eventually assembled amounted to airtight prosecutable proof, Not after 6 years in a case long since closed, and I want to be honest that this isn't a story with a clean, satisfying arrest at the end of it. Priscilla helped us package everything into a formal request to reopen the investigation, and as of the last update I have, the county is reviewing it slowly, the way these things apparently always move. I don't know yet whether it will amount to anything more than an official acknowledgement that the original conclusion was too hastily reached. Some days that feels like enough, other days it doesn't feel like nearly enough at all. But the truth about Adrian's death, however incomplete it remains, wasn't actually the center of what I needed to resolve with Elise, and I think we both understood that clearly by the time all of this had settled into something we could finally sit with instead of chase. I told her, one evening not long after everything with Desmond and the investigation had come fully into focus, I was never angry that you loved him. She looked at me waiting, and I made myself finish the thought even though it was harder to say out loud than I expected. I was angry because you stopped letting me be your husband. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, you started making decisions about both of our lives without me, the same way you'd apparently been making decisions about your own grief without me for years before we ever married. I don't need you to have never loved him. I need you to actually let me in instead of protecting me from things you've already decided I can't handle. Elise was quiet for a long time before she answered, and when she did, her voice had a kind of clarity I hadn't heard from her in months. I think I confused grief with loyalty, she said. I think some part of me believed that if I let myself fully move forward, if I let you all the way in instead of keeping a piece of this to myself, it would mean Adrian mattered less than he actually did. I understand now that isn't how it actually works. Loving you was never going to erase what he meant to me. I just didn't trust that fact enough to actually live like I believed it. The baby was born about 6 weeks after that conversation, a daughter, healthier and louder than either of us quite expected given how much of the pregnancy had been shadowed by everything else happening around us. I won't pretend the birth itself resolved anything between Elise and me the way it might in a tidier version of this story. We started therapy together not long after, both individual and joint sessions, working slowly through a version of trust that had been damaged in ways that didn't heal simply because the mystery behind Adrian's death had finally, mostly, been resolved. Elise kept one photograph of Adrian, a single frame from the box in that storage unit, displayed now in a small frame on a bookshelf rather than hidden away, something we talked through carefully in one of our sessions until it stopped feeling like a threat sitting in our own living room and started feeling like simply a fact of her history, one I no longer needed to compete with. A few months after our daughter was born, I came home one evening and found Elise sitting in the nursery again, in almost exactly the same spot I'd found her that first night, holding that same photograph. My stomach tightened out of old habit before I'd even fully registered what I was looking at, but she wasn't crying this time. She was smiling quietly in a way that looked less like grief and more like something closer to peace. I finally understand something, she said before I'd even asked. What? I said. She looked down at the photograph for a moment longer, then set it gently back on the shelf where it belonged. Missing someone doesn't mean I have to live in the past to honor it, she said. Then she reached over and picked up our daughter from the crib, settling her against her shoulder with the same easy motion I'd watched her practice 100 times over the past few months, and looked at me with an expression that finally, for the first time since all of this started, made me feel like I wasn't standing in competition with anyone at all. I understood, watching her in that moment, that I never actually had been. I just spent the better part of a year believing I was because it was easier to be jealous of a dead man than to sit with how frightened Elise had actually been, for years, of a truth she didn't know how to carry alone anymore. Edit for everyone asking about the investigation. It's still moving through the county's review process, slower than any of us would like, and I'm not going to share more detail than that while it's ongoing. To the people asking how Elise and I are doing now, better than I expected. Most days, though better and fully healed, turned out to be two very different things, and I think we've both stopped expecting the second one to arrive on any particular schedule.